Right. Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you very, very much for coming to this. We are delighted to be welcoming Lenka Vráblíková, who is only the second of our Institute of Advanced Studies residential fellows ever, and the second one who is coming in this particular year, our inaugural year of running these fellowships. And we are delighted today to have Lenka coming to talk to us about a series of questions around feminist ethnomycology, populism, questions of migratism and nationalism as that is emerging across Europe, but it also has many ramifications for other parts of the world. So it really brings together feminism, environmental humanities, and some really important questions about political agency that are very much pressing matters of the day. So we're going to, Lenka's going to take over the screen in a moment and start to screen. This will give us a little moment of making sure this is working effectively for everyone. So I can ask that people stay mute for that, but then we will certainly have time for lots of discussion and questions after. And I thank everybody for showing up. So please do be thinking about anything you want to be talking about and asking as we get going. And without further ado, Lenka, I am most delighted to ask you to take over the screen.
Okay, so you're going to do the admissions, right? Fine. Okay. Can you hear me well, everyone? So, hello, everybody. Masha, thank you for a kind introduction and a warm welcome. And before I start, I want to thank the Institute and the university for choosing my project and for hosting me for this residency. And I also want to thank especially to Masha for her encouragement and support of my work and for helping me to figure out some of the arguments I will be presenting today as well. And I also want to thank her as the director of the Institute and her team, Laura, Janine, and Helen, who were really putting a lot of work into this love and care to make this happen and make me feel welcome here and making it really great and exciting experience for me here at the Loughborough University. I also want to thank you who are here today online for your curiosity and for your willingness to engage with my project. And I really, really appreciate that. Thank you. So today's talk will have 3 parts. First, I will tell you more about myself and my interest in mushrooms and in fungi in general. Let me just admit this thing first. Then I will talk about mushrooms in relation to the Brexit campaign, looking specifically at issues around nation or nationalism, nature, belonging, embodiment, affect, and white heteropatriarchy. And then I will conclude by briefly introducing a research proposal Masha and I put together earlier this year. So, is it moving? My slides are not moving. Let me try again, sorry. I'm trying to make my screen, my presentation work, guys. Sorry. Okay, so it's working. Sorry about that. So this is me. My name is Lenka Vráblíková, and this is a picture of me with a mushroom called birch bolete. In Czech, we call it křemenáč březový. This birch bolete mushroom is an edible mushroom, and it is also a mycorrhizal mushroom. This means that it lives in symbiosis with plants. In this case, as you can already guess from the name of the mushroom, with birch. They are connected through their roots. For fungi, this underground roots network is actually their main body of of the mushroom, and we call it mycelium. So I'm just telling this because we will need this later, this information. This picture was taken in March in South Africa, where I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of South Africa under the mentorship of Professor Deirdre Byrne, a scholar in ecofeminism and science fiction. However, South Africa is not the place where I gained my interest in mushrooms. As you can guess from my name, especially the gender inflection ova at the end of my surname or my accent, I'm not from South Africa, but from a region known as Eastern Europe, especially Czech Republic. In this culture, love and knowledge of mushrooms is a common, and as you can see from a Facebook post of Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, also an object of national pride. And I highlighted for you there how they call Czechia a mushroom picking superpower. So mushroom hunting, similarly to spending time in weekend cottages, became a significant part of post-Second World War life in Czechoslovakia. Furthermore, during normalization, which that's how we call a period after the Warsaw Pact invasion in 1968, they also became symbols of the consumer gains, which were a substitute for the loss of personal and political freedom, which the socialist regime, in addition to persecution, implemented as a way of sustaining its rule. This has been reflected in Czech and Slovak popular culture and art. For instance, in a poem, "The Czechs are excellent mushroom pickers" by anarchist and artist Milan Kozelka. Unfortunately, I don't have the English translation of the poem, otherwise I would share it with you. The person who taught me the most things and the most important things about mushrooms, how to find them, how to identify them, how to pick them, process them, and cook them, was my grandmother. Jana Divišová, and she turned 86 this year. Huh? This photograph was taken in 2012 in her house after one of our mushroom hunts in the nearby woods. And as you can see, we're beaming with pride, our bounty clean and sorted according to species and sizes on display. My primary relationship to mushrooms is thus not so much scholarly as it is practical, passionate, and affectionate. Mushrooms and mushroom foraging are imbricated in the memories and other stories and practices through which I relate to nature, the communities I'm part of, to my childhood and my loved ones, such as my grandmother. 2012, the year the picture was taken, was the year I started my PhD in cultural studies at the University of Leeds here in the UK. While I was in Leeds, I became friends with other feminists, and at that time also a PhD student, Elspeth Mitchell, who you can see in the picture. I assume it was my never-ending raves about mushrooms and feminism, combined with Elspeth's experience of her research stay in Finland, a country that could be considered another mushrooms picking superpower, which brought her to mushrooms and also to me. On this photograph, we are posing with a mushroom, which is called chicken of the woods. In Czech, we call that sírovec žluto-oranžový. It is a parasitic, bright orange yellow mushroom that grows on trunks of trees, especially oak. Elspeth and I got to combine our love for mushrooms with feminist scholarship through activism. As part of the Teach Out program that accompanied Strike, which is a union here in the UK, UCU Strike at the University of Leeds in 2017, Elspeth and I launched called Feminist Mushroom Hunting and Feminist Readings. And it was a way of enabling us and other participants to critically and creatively reflect on the conditions of feminist academic labor. And after today's talk, the people who are here in Loughborough will actually also go for a walk around the campus with us. Elspeth and I are developing this work further, and we are currently writing an article for a special issue on mushrooms and visual culture. This brings me to other encounters that brought us to this project we call Feminist ethnomycology. Firstly, it was the encounter with the work of Anna Tsing, a US-based anthropologist who in 2015 wrote a groundbreaking book, Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in the capitalist ruins, where by following mushroom species Matsutake, Tsing examines and tries to imagine ways of living in times of global environmental and social precarity. The second significant influence on our work is the rapidly growing interest in fungi within the English-speaking, which in a way means global, scholarship in sciences, arts, and humanities. Some people in this connection even speak about the fungal turn. This interest is mirrored by the unprecedented attention fungi have been gaining, also outside of academia, in environmental and social activism, art, and popular culture. It seems that fungi are becoming instrumental to the way in which humans narrate their relationship to the world and imagine its future. Sorry, I just let someone in. Imagine their future. Where was I? In addition to the growing popularity, there has also been a shift in culture and political imagination about mushrooms, from perceiving these organisms as something to be feared or hated, to something which promises hope or even salvation. These new fungal stories are furthermore being told by very diverse culture and political actors, from NASA, pharmaceutical and wellness industries, and advocates of green capitalism, to more radical discourses and practices that have been trying to imagine a more just world beyond the constraints of the current regimes of power, and that are forged especially by artists, activists, and scholars. But before I outline how I aspire to contribute to fungal storytelling with such a radical potential, I'm going to present an analysis of a part of a narrative which is intrinsically embedded in the current regimes of power, a story about mushrooms, migratism, and racism in the Brexit campaign. So, mushrooms. So here you see some mushroom pictures, and these are mushrooms which I found here on the Loughborough campus. So just to get people who are intending the walk a little bit excited. Mushrooms have long occupied a highly ambivalent position in the cultural imagination, inciting disgust and fear, as well as wonder and fascination. Neither plants nor animals, they grow up unexpectedly, but also in regular lines and circles. Some of them are medicinal and edible, whereas others are toxic or even poisonous. Sometimes they're both. Ethnomycology argues that the ambivalence in attitudes towards these organisms is a result of their diverse ecology, unbounded biology, and highly variable biodiversity, combined with the limited knowledge humans have about them. So there's about 6 times more fungi species than plants, and twice as many as animals, but it is only about 6% of fungi species which have been described, so there is plenty of room for discoveries. This ambivalence in attitudes towards fungi has elicited extreme polarized sentiments, leading Valentina and Gordon Watson, the founders of ethnomycology, to describe cultures that embrace and esteem mushrooms, such as the Slavic culture from which Valentina and I come from, as mycophilic, and those that disdain them, such as the Anglo-Saxon culture, the culture of her husband Gordon, as mycophobic. In my work, I propose examining mycophobia and mycophilia not as exclusive binaries, but as critically entangled and mutually constitutive cultural positions. I deploy the ambivalence of mushrooms in culture imagination to the analysis of visual and elements of media discourse to examine how forests, mushrooms, and their foragers have figured as tropes of othering in the Brexit campaign's migratism and its racist entanglements. In order to do so, I mobilize a notion of othering, which I conceptualize as a complex set of differentiating temporal and spatial bodily encounters along the established binary trope, native and alien, and its correlates, human, non-human, citizen, foreign, male, female, civilized, primitive, global north, global south, and west and east. This conceptualization draws from the work of feminist and postcolonial scholars who have theorized othering as contextual, contradictory, and fluid process, and particularly Sara Ahmed's theorization, articulated in her book Strange Encounters, embodied others in postcoloniality. And when you will read my article, you will see that I talk about the Brexit campaign, but then I also trace the history of these tropes around mushrooms, around European modernity. And two other examples I look at in my article is this anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda children's picture book called Der Gipfels. And the other thing which I analyze in the article is the history and taxonomy of the mushroom species called Auricularia auricula, which in many European languages is called Judas ear, and in English even more problematically, Jew's ear. But today we are just going to speak about the Brexit thing. So, Brexit. The Brexit campaign began to enter the public domain in early 2015, and the key point has been stark opposition to migration, presented as a means of reinstating the sovereignty of the British people, depicted as being under siege, with racist English nationalism taking the central stage. British media, and especially the tabloid press, were instrumental in the fabrication and dissemination of this message. Coincidentally with the Brexit campaign, another topic appeared in many national newspapers, a call for the strict regulation of mushroom picking in British woodland. The tabloid, the Daily Express, managed to contribute to both debates in one piece. In an article with the headline, Eastern European mushroom mobs, new forest is stripped bare by fungi rustlers, a reporter informed the British public that, and I quote from the article, rangers patrolling the new forest are on a high alert amidst fierce black market gangs, many thought to be Eastern Europeans, who are stripping the beauty spots of its edible mushrooms. Experts, the reporter continued, have warned the gangs could even kill, because pickers who don't know the different species are likely to take deadly toadstools and other poisonous fungi in mistake for edible and safe mushrooms. A spokesman of New Forest Association blasted it as an unacceptable fact that was spoiling the forest's autumn beauty and harming wildlife. They added that every year, bands full of unskilled laborers descend upon the forest and indiscriminately strip our woodlands of every bit of fungi they encounter, leaving nothing for families on a day's outing in the forest who want a few mushrooms as a mealtime treat. The reporter further speculated that these gangs are thought to include cheap labor in the form of EU immigrants, and brought a testimony by a farmer who also confirmed that the forest is being exploited and thrashed. Finally, the readers were informed that New Forest was not the only site where the gangs operated, but that other forests were also endangered, concluded with the demand for clear policy and strict regulation that will put total ban on mushroom removal. As the quotation testifies, the newspaper article employs language of othering that is reminiscent of racist and classist condemnations of travelers, Jews, as well as Black, Indigenous, and other people of color that has a long tradition in UK media, and which, in the aftermath of after the so-called war on terror and migration crisis, has been used particularly in relation to Muslim communities. In the article, the intruders are already known and recognized as the origin of the danger. That the mushroom pickers or mushroom mobs are Eastern Europeans, which is a vague and homogenizing term used in the UK in disparaging manner to name people from Central and Eastern Europe, as well as a synonym specifically for Polish people, is presented as a given and a common knowledge which the reporter shares with those she has interviewed for her article, as well as her readers. Their knowability is a result of one of the normalized ways of sensing strangers that in British current cultural and political context has relied on a chain of metonymies unfolding in the following direction. Eastern European, unskilled and cheap labor, EU immigrants engaging in illegal activities, Eastern Europeans, harm. The newspaper article mobilizes further tropes of othering to portray the danger these intruders represent. The language used to depict their activities invokes a sinister and violent attack, whilst expressions such as full bands descend every year, or using plural forms of words that already invoke great numbers, such as gangs or mobs, portray the mushroom pickers as being too many, as being overabundant. Importantly, British families are named as those who are impoverished by the commercial mushroom pickers. Families, as Ahmed argues, play a significant role in othering, standing for women and children. Such invocation feeds on and reinforces white heteropatriarchy, implying its fundamental aspect, the compulsory binary gender divide of complementary opposites, where masculinity is portrayed as strong, active, and potent, and thus as able to attack or protect, and femininity as passive, weak, and vulnerable, and thus attackable and in need of protection. In addition to the invocation of families, the feminine coding of the bodies that are portrayed as endangered is achieved by other metonymic associations that are attached to traditionally defined white femininity, such as beauty, here employed in relation to nature, and they speak about the forest autumn beauty, which, as the newspaper article argues, the intruders strip off and spoil. The binary gender division employed as a metaphor is thus yet another vehicle for the demarcation between us and them, a demarcation which reversely reinforces and legitimizes white heteropatriarchy. The mention of families also helps to complexify the article's effective charge. According to Ahmed's reading of racism as politics of hatred, and I quote, a politics that directs hatred towards others, that creates others as objects to be hated as well as feared, often presents itself as politics of love. By portraying themselves as acting out of love, love for their families, communities, the nation, or in this case also forests and their wildlife, including edible mushrooms, the newspaper article constitutes normal British citizens. The nature-loving, Anglo-Saxon, white, heterosexual, middle-class, cisgender subjects, and portrays them as those who are endangered and thus in need of protection, whilst justifying their fear and hatred of immigrants. The newspaper article thus suggests that it is not only British forests and edible mushrooms that are threatened by the invasion of gangs from Eastern Europe, but also the nation and its people. The United Kingdom, this at once material and fantasized entity, is taken hostage by the immigrants. It incites the fantasy of the idealized community and the demarcation of outsiders. It represents a discourse of survival where the communities of those posited as normal citizens and their spaces are represented as being in crisis. Such representation of the here and now enables the idealization of what is assumed to be absent, a fantasy of the community and its spaces as valuable and innocent. As Ahmed argues, this investment plays a significant role in the preservation of the unequal social order. It binds the protection of property and maintenance of social privilege, and simultaneously conceals the social histories of conflict, exploitation, and violence that have instituted them. This time, however, the site in crisis is not an urban space, which is the space about which Ahmed usually speaks about. For instance, she speaks about the neighborhood watch programs. That's the thing she discusses in the book. This time, however, we are not in an urban space, but in the forest. I argue that encounters which do not take place only in human-specific contexts, but involve sites that are usually considered to be outside of culture and history, and forests and their wildlife in particular, significantly amplify certain aspects of othering. It can be argued that through analogy, the context of what is considered to be nature helps detach those who are subjected to othering from their social histories and to fortify the metonymic associations that constitute their figuration. In other words, in the proximity of the nature, it is easy to make othering look natural, to represent otherness as an inherent quality, to normalize it, and to justify othering as morally right. However, in addition to this general point, forward the following argument. Locating a narrative of othering within the forest intensifies the fundamental aspect of othering, the sharing of a fantasy of an idealized we, which rests on the representation of communities' presence as being in crisis. The intensification of othering within the forest is due to the position forests have occupied in the cultural imagination of European colonial modernity, and particularly in the formation of British nation state and its correlate, English nationalism. Predominantly, forests have been understood as standing for an outside. So the Latin origin of the word forest is foris, which translates as outside. that constitutes the inside of sociality and continues to haunt it. However, as anthropologists and historians of forests have demonstrated, such an idea has its origin in a particular social and historical context. Their outsidedness made possible by making forests both materially and discursively wild and empty spaces of asocial nature. And I think this is really significant, and for me it's one of the most important things, and that's why I love Anna Zink's work or Oliver Rackham's work on woodlands, is because they are constantly deconstructing this opposition between culture and nature in every aspect of their work and trace the effects of that binary we are using in our minds all the time. So, where are we? So, how they explain it? Why is it historical and contextual, this formation? It's only through oppressive practices and discourses, such as those surrounding the evictions of peasants and the enclosures of woodland and other commons for the use of national elites, why the formation of European modernity and the regimes that define it, such as capitalism, imperial colonialism, nationalism, racism, and heteropatriarchy, being made possible. In relation to the British context specifically, the UK's current woodland is far from being a residue of an original primeval wildwood. English woods, in contrast to woodland in other parts of Europe, such as Scotland, Poland, or Germany, have especially been busy social and commercial sites since at least the Roman period, which means 2000 years. In the UK, the name forest, with a capital F furthermore, has not signified a particular topography, like a space where you have a lot of trees, but administration. The legal demarcation of royal gaming reserves. Through decrees, this administration, and I quote from Simon Chama, was imposed on large areas of the English countryside that were not wooded at all, and which including tracts of pasture, meadow, cultivated farmland, and even towns, end of quote. Ironically enough, this new forest regime was not initiated by the English royalty, but the Normans, commencing with the foundation of the new forest by William the Conqueror around 1079. The competition for privileges and power to exploit the woodland between the different appropriated elites, namely the royalty, nobility, and the church, triggered by this new forest regime, gave rise to a myth about, and I quote again from Simon Chama, ravening Norman despotism, annihilating whole villages and parishes to create private hunting reserves of the new forest, end of quote. This myth was then foundational to yet another widely popular and still influential myth specific to English folklore, a myth of greenwood freedom and pre-feudal reciprocal social order that had allegedly taken place prior to Norman invasion, narrated since the Middle Ages through a figure of a heroic outlaw, such as this one, for example. Forests thus have not only been significant in English folklore and popular culture, but have been entangled in the formation of the British nation-state and national belonging. Furthermore, this entanglement has not been only material and administrative, but has, from the very start, involved the working of fantasy and imagination. Imagined as a shadow of civilization, English forests have been made to reflect a fantasy of the idealized we of the nation through the demarcation of outsiders, a fantasy that has also been foundational to English nationalism, a fantasy of a defiance against ruling elites associated with foreigners. My reading of the Daily Express newspaper article shows how this entanglement and links othering, nation belonging, forests, mushrooms, and their foragers continues to unfold in the context of the Brexit campaign. As argued earlier, it is not only the British forests and their wildlife that are presented as valuable and innocent, and that are currently under attack by immigrants from Eastern Europe. The object of the nostalgia is also that which the forest and its wildlife are meant to shadow, the nation and its people. The nationalist anti-immigration rhetoric mobilized in the newspaper article thus can be interpreted as echoing the myth which has accompanied the foundation of the new forest and as contributing to the shared fantasy that has been circulated in England and later in the UK since the Middle Ages, the idealization of the time before the invasion of, in this case, Norman intruders. The Brexit campaign thus can be considered the most visible and effective recent mobilization of this fantasy. addressed through the discourse on forests, mushrooms, and their foragers, constructed in the Daily Express, Brexit could indeed be seen to provide a solution to the problem the newspaper article raises, although it is not the solution it called for. Instead of mushroom picking, what Brexit promises to ban are the immigrants. However, the yearning for the idealized homogeneous nation and its great past does not define only the current political climate of the UK. Here, in the UK, it might, among many, be Eastern Europeans who are at the receiving end of the anti-immigration outcry. At home, however, those who are figured as strangers and feared as dangerous in the UK become the normal citizens in need of protection from others figured as dangerous strangers. The way othering operates and benefits those who have been associated with white, masculine, heterosexual, cisgendered, and non-disabled bodies in the global north and west, at the expense of those who have not, is contextual, contradictory, and fluid. I therefore want to make clear that the intention of my contribution is not to reiterate the claim to victimhood and innocence of white, Central, and Eastern Europeans, as has often been done in an attempt to negotiate the complex and complicit relationship with European colonial modernity, also revealed within the context of Brexit, especially after the end of socialism in Central and Eastern European countries, where the majority of the population has not been coded as racially, religiously, or civilizationally absolutely different from the so-called core Europeans. Nationalism and the unspoken insistence on whiteness have become the most effective means of asserting Europeanness. Furthermore, as Akbugo Emejulu rightly points out, the hostility, exploitation, and violence which white immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe have experienced in the UK before and after Brexit, unfortunately, do not guarantee any imperative to dismantle racial hierarchy and racism. Similarly, neither do I want to join the scolding of the Daily Express or its readers in a way it has predominantly been done in other more liberal British media, such as The Guardian or BBC News. Continuing the framing that has governed the mainstream anti-racist and pro-immigration discourses in Europe since the end of the Second World War, they tend to produce individualizing and psychologizing accounts that frame migratism and racism as an interpersonal prejudice of flawed individuals or groups whose beliefs are incompatible with the so-called European values. In relation to Brexit specifically, as Gurminder K. Bambra has shown, such interpretation feeds into the argumentation of populist right-wing politicians who have claimed that the reason for the opposition to immigration were merely economic, constructing the so-called white working class, whose grievances have for decades been allegedly ignored by liberal cosmopolitan elites, as the principal victim. However, as Bambra further argues, despite the appeal and seeming explanatory power of this discourse, and critically adopted across political elites, the mainstream media, as well as most of the scholarship, the centrality of race and racism to Brexit campaign is undeniable. And although racism in the UK is intrinsically bound to English nationalism and its correlate, the longing for the British imperial project, it is also not idiosyncratic. It feeds on and further reinforces the racial hierarchy that has defined the European colonial modernity and its political structures, the nation state, liberal democracy, as well as supranational formations such as the EU, which especially after the joining of Central and Eastern European countries in 2004 became Fortress Europe, that aggressively implements structural heteropatriarchal migrantism, racism, and classism on populations across its borders. Instances of othering, such as the one produced by Brexit campaign's racist migratism, therefore demand an intellectual and political response that will be different from simply taking pro-immigration or pro-EU stance. As follows from the work of scholars I have drawn on, and those you can see on your screens, a response which would enable to contest the material, discursive, and fantasized structures that produce and naturalize othering needs to begin with the understanding that gendering racialization has been a central principle of European colonial modernity that continues to figure our present. In my work, I try to contribute to this project by following mushrooms and by developing work which would enable us to imagine belonging beyond the constraints of European colonial postmodernity. The research proposal Masha, Meskimen and I submitted to European Research Council under the name There is a Fungus Among Us, Feminist Visual Ethnomycology and the Decolonial Crisis in Europe also takes this direction. Through transdisciplinary cross-cultural research in Central and Eastern Central and Eastern Europe and the UK, it focuses on examining how fungi can become potent means to unravel the divisive binary native and alien, and a means to generate nations of belonging in a shared world beyond the such dualisms of Eurocentric thinking. Combining scholarship from disciplines such as ethnomycology, visual culture and media studies, transnational feminisms and environmental humanities, it proceeds through archive and media research, collaborative practice-led research, and the development of transnational feminist approaches to visual and textual analysis of material and non-material elements of visual culture. The envisioned research project that also consists of activities such as foraging walks, an international symposium, fungal art project commissions, and an art exhibition. We hope that researchers, artists, and mushroom lovers who are part of Loughborough academic community, such as those included in these initiatives and networks, which you can see on my slides, will join us in this endeavor. Thank you. Okay.
Join me in saying, saying thank you very much. Francesca's put a thing. That was great. Thanks, everybody. I'm imagining that there are going to be plenty of questions. So I'm going to take the little host thing back from Lenka so that I can monitor a bit of the chat and assist with that. But please, colleagues, if you would like to ask a question, you could use your little clap hands or your little hand sign to wave, or if you put on your video, you can hold your hand so we can see you and indicate that way, or feel free to write in the chat, which we'll keep an eye on. But if people could put their videos on so Lenka can see people as well now, that would be very helpful. So I'm going to open the floor effectively. Is there anybody who would like to start? People are gradually coming into view. Does anyone have a question they'd like to begin with, or a point or an issue for discussion?
Or share some mushroom story?
Yes. Francesca, would you like to start us off?
Hi Lenka, hi Marsha, good to see you both and everyone else. Well, it's just a curiosity on mushrooms, really. Same types of mushrooms can grow in different parts of the world. You know, tomatoes are hard, or you know, I mean, I grow vegetables, and some vegetables are impossible to grow in Brighton. So I don't know if it is if there are global species or there are local, like some vegetables. Thank you.
So thank you, Francesco, for a nice question. And yeah, so mushrooms are global. And so they grow actually everywhere. You would find in places you would not expect to find things to grow, like a desert or you know, even in Antarctica, there will be some mushrooms. And yeah, you've got, the species are global. So for instance, jelly ear, this mushroom, which is in my article, that one is all over the world in tropical, subtropical and mild regions of the globe. And so they will be everywhere. And what I think is really interesting about that is like how that particular mushroom figures in different cultures. So people who are in Asia really love jelly ears. It's very popular there, and they even produce them, you know, they grow them. And it does not have this anti-Semitic association, for instance, which it has in the European culture. So I think this is pretty interesting. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Sorry, I can see your hand, and I can see your hand kind of shown. How do you want to do first, and then
I just wanted to point out that there are some mushrooms that grow in some parts of the world and not other parts of the world. So you have, for example, Amanita phalloides, which is very poisonous and looks similar to the Amanita caesarea and is not in many parts of Europe and Asia. So you have people who travel to places where Amanita phalloides grows, and they pick it because it looks similar to an edible mushroom, but is in fact quite poisonous. So.
Yeah, and maybe just to develop on that, that's definitely good. And for instance, sorry, I can hear myself there. Can you hear me well?
yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, so for instance, with matsutake, which is the mushroom which Anateng famously analyzes, is that matsutake used to grow only in Asia, but because of logging, you know, and people using and disturbing forests in, for instance, in the US, in Oregon, matsutake is now growing in the US, and no one expects, you know. So there's this like a certain interactions between what is happening on the planet, what peoples are doing, how they travel, how they also spread the mushrooms and destroy or do something to the environment and encourage growth of mushrooms, which you know, matsutake was not common in the US before. Yeah, so thank you for that comment. Yes, who wanted to say something? Was it Hillary?
Yeah, Hillary.
Hi, Lenka. Thank you so much. It was really fascinating. This is picking up on just, I can remember the story about the New Forest, and just picking up on an aspect of it, which was that these mushrooms that were being stolen were intended for posh restaurants. And the photographs that seem to go with it of the people who were picking the mushrooms, the two people seem to be wearing a Barber jacket, which of course is a marker of a sort of middle class, upper middle class, white country landed person, which I, you know, just something I noted. But is your research going to follow the travel of cuisines? And not just the, you know, as well as people and the mushrooms themselves. You know, I'm totally not invested in this question in any shape or form whatsoever.
Yeah, thank you, Hillary. So yeah, about this posh cuisine, posh restaurants, it was also in that article I was analyzing, but you know, there's so many things you could pick on, and definitely it's there. And there is this, and Anateng also speaks about it, this worry people have that something like collecting mushrooms or berries would make someone rich. And it's like a stealing from them, you know, this like you somehow become, you know, you found this fortune in the forest, you know, this belief, you know, that you can become millionaire through collecting berries, for instance. And, you know, like, and in a way having this fear of people who are like on the edges of capitalism, you know, like, and usually it's migrant communities who are doing this work because they cannot get other work, you know, in normal different employment. So they are doing this labor, but there's this fear that these guys will get rich, you know. So I think that's very strong there as well, around that, this kind of like a on the edge of capitalism, you know, these are these things growing there, and, you know, you think that there are millions lying around forests. and definitely the cuisines and recipes. And I'm also enormously interested in fermentation, which is obviously connected to mushrooms and fungi as well, and doing things like cider, you know, and kimchi, or what we do in the Czech Republic is sauerkraut, right? Because that's pretty kind of like a global thing as well. And I think that could actually be one of the ways of developing notions of belonging, that people have some kind of memories of some aspects of that during, you know, oh, I know that, we did that, you know. So for instance, in South Africa, you have this fermented beer in Klomboti, which is a social practice, you know, and it's important because it's relating you to your ancestors. You would make it for, you know, when there's some social gathering, like funeral or marriage or whatever, but also it puts people together. And I think, you know, like there could be some kind of like a way of telling stories differently about what's happening in the planet and finding a different, you know, forging different type of connections and relations with people. And it's definitely also, I think, feminist thing, you know, because that's, you know, cooking, preparing food and stuff, that's usually, you know, what in a lot of cultures, it's women's responsibilities. So I think there's a lot of, you know, politics of the kitchen happening, and preservation and preparation of food. So I would definitely want to do some feminist, you know, mushroom cookbook, for instance, and projects like that. That would be super cool.
Excellent, thanks. My mother was born in the New Forest, so I'll ask her if she has any memories of foraging and cooking.
Excellent.
Yeah, cool. We can do it. Like, yeah, tracing the histories, you know, women sharing through generations their memories and relationships to nature or cooking. So that's one of the projects we would also like to do, you know, like getting from my grandmother, how she relates to the forest, how she prepares mushrooms, or how she, you know, preserves them. And that would be some kind of like a feminist way of sharing knowledge, you know, and also from a perspective of institutions and non-academic way of sharing knowledge. Yeah. And there is a project Elspeth and I also want to do about getting women together, foraging, and talking about their politics, art, and activism. And we had this plan to do that walk, one in the UK, one in Czech Republic. And I think that would be also enormously interesting because, for instance, in Czech Republic, when we had the dissent against the communism, they either were in flats, in private spaces, or they were outside of cities, you know? They were on these weekend cottages. They were sitting in the forest, right? And doing this kind of like a political, political collective politics there. And yeah, so I think that would be also very interesting because also, you know, the dissent against communist regime was called the underground. So I think there would be a lot of, you know, way of thinking about mushrooms and going, you know, being in relation to this kind of political dissidency in Eastern Europe.
Backup, are you raising your hand? Yeah, please, please. And I can see Marco is raising as well.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, Marco, do you want to go first?
No, you go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot to Lenka for her highly intriguing talk. I just wanted to remind people or make people familiar of the fact that one of those pictures you showed, Lenka, the infamous cover of the book by Julius Streicher, the gift pills, one of the symbols of or tools of Nazi propaganda. It has been actually translated and published in the Czech Republic in February this year, or maybe it was published a little earlier, but it made news in February. So yeah, it's quite astonishing that even in these days, you know, that there is a market for this kind of tropes and all symbols of the past and of those connections that were made by the Nazi propaganda between Jews and mushrooms. But my question, I have a question that relates to something else Lenka, the term you made, you used, the distinction, I think you made between mushroom-loving cultures and mushroom, I don't know, hating or fearing cultures. I think you used the term mycophobic cultures, and I'm not sure if you use the term mycophilic cultures, but I guess that would be the polar opposite, right? And I just want to know your thoughts, if you have any thoughts, or if there are any theories on how these cultures developed, how it came, how did it actually come up that some cultures have evolved as mycophobic and some as mycophilic. And I wonder if it has to do with the different course of modernization and industrialization in particular, with the advances of deforestation in countries like England. Yeah, just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Thank you, Václav. These are really good points and questions. So just develop on what you were saying about that thing being just published now in Czech translation. It has also been republished in the US, huh? So that's the thing, you know. So that's actually what caught my attention to, is that these kind of stories, in addition to all these positive or nice stories about mushrooms, these negative ones are coming up again as well. And just to continue on their Gipfels, it actually functioned as an evidence during the Nuremberg trials, and it helped to the publisher of the Der Stürmer, Streicher, was convicted and he was executed, and this book was as an evidence of his anti-Semitism there. So I think that's very important, and these things are coming back, you know, and reappearing, and that's what I was trying to say throughout the talk and in the article. And you said it right, it's mycophobic and mycophilic. And it actually comes from that very first book, in the founding book of ethnomycology, this 1957 book by Valina and Gordon Wasson. And they're talking there about these cultures, and it came about by that story that she is Russian and he is British, and they got married and they went for honeymoon, and she saw mushrooms and she got totally excited and he got totally scared. And then they were working through that together, and then they started doing research specifically on psychoactive mushrooms. But I don't know what the explanations would be, what the theory would be why someone turns mycophilic or mycophobic as a culture. And by the way, I don't think that now we can talk about the whole culture being like that. You know, in the globalized world, it's just like, I think it's, these things are working together all the time somehow. But they have a couple of stories or kind of explanations they're trying to propose. One of them, what Valentina says, is the experience of hunger, that you don't have things to eat. So you just go to the forest and you forage things. So that would be one of her explanations. But yeah, I don't know.
Can I invite Marco before we, and then Rachel, and then I think if that's okay, I'm mindful of our timing, that if we have Marco and then Rachel, I think that's as much as we're going to manage, I'm afraid.
Marcia, thank you, Lenka. Very interesting. Lenka already had a one-to-one conversation, so I'm very appreciative of your project. I think it's a very interesting entry point, very interesting point from my perspective that I study, interesting point to study the nation. There is obviously the obvious point from my perspective, but I think there would be another way to talk about this aspect of the naturalization of the nation. So how in this case the practice of collecting mushroom is very much an example of how the nation gets inscribed in the nature. It's very interesting. But just a point, maybe it's interesting for you also to look at a rich body of literature, which is the literature about everyday nationhood. Everyday nationhood is a way of looking at the nation bottom up, what people do with nation. And here there is very interesting aspect of how practices of mushroom collection actually both mark belonging and unbelonging. Because if you look at it from the British perspective, a culture which is not used, obviously this practice is a clear sign that you don't belong here, because here we don't do these kind of things, right? Whereas from the perspective of the diaspora, of the people there, is very much a trait that allowed them to reproduce a sense of community, of national community, because this is what we do at home and we keep doing here. So there is a very interesting tension there, but it's very much, again, related to these practices. So that brings back to that everyday nationhood, that there is quite a lot. So happy to share some literature there. That's it, more of a comment than a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. That's really useful, and that's very, yeah, I'll definitely look at everyday nation literature, and you're totally right about belonging in nature, and also in its, I would say, class and racialized aspects of it, because what we say with Elspeth is that who, how, and for what purpose collects mushrooms tells you a lot about those people, right? So, for instance, what I was analyzing there. So, if you collect a bit for your family, it's fine. If you're a commercial picker, how you pick it, what kind of techniques you use, you know, there are all these like little shades of who belongs to what and in what degree, and the hierarchies are coming in to play, which I think is enormously interesting. And yeah, you can learn a lot from looking at a practice. You know, sometimes it's a hobby, sometimes it's labor, you know, why people do it and for what purpose. That it's on this edge of like it's a practice which is on the edge of like a lot of various ways of relating to the world. And yeah, and I think it's also really interesting in a sense of conservation, you know, like nature conservation, because it seems that nature conservation can be quite conservative as well. You know, this kind of like trying to separate people and nature, and then making decisions who is culture and who is nature. And then you have a problem when you have communities which are related to forests or live in forests. So you are then saying that they are nature and they're not human. You know, like these all kind of like separations you're doing and the effects they have on the communities we live in, you know. So I think that's enormously interesting. Yeah, thank you for the comment.
And Rachel, can I turn to you now? And you'll be our wrap-up question. And thank you to everyone for showing up and having such a vibrant time. Actually, this has been really exciting. So please, Rachel.
Thank you, and thank you, Lenka. This is, I suppose, a question comment more in terms of, I suppose, the concept of fungi and the mushroom and how it's applied within contemporary art. Because I've just been looking recently at the works of Tiffany Chung, and she creates these maps. And I've just been reading something that describes the maps as fungal, partially because of their aesthetic and they look kind of like spores and things. But also, I think, because they represent this concept of layering and the interconnections that are, as you've been talking about, that have been forged through the sort of the focal point of the mushroom. So I'm just wondering, and perhaps this is kind of going more into yours and Marsha's project, in terms of the visual strategies within contemporary art that you're seeing in relation to mushrooms and fungi and mushroom gathering and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks, Rachel. Yeah, so it's becoming very popular in the art world, which, because I think that especially mycelium and thinking about the mycorrhizal, you know, connections and everything, that has a massive potential in terms of aesthetics, but also politics and ethics, to imagining, you know, like how we can relate to each other differently. And yeah, and I'm really interested in that and seeing how this is going to develop. And I was very fortunate to some people who are doing very cool projects, as for instance, Aneta Monachisa and Lucia Tkačová in Czech Republic. They're doing really cool projects with mushrooms when they, so it's about psychoactive mushrooms. So, you know, someone mentioned here, Hannah mentioned the Amanita muscaria, you know, the fly agaric, which I think you all know. It's that pretty one, the red one with the white dots. So it's not how everyone has been telling you. So if you eat that, it will make you a bit sick, but you would also get high. So And what some communities in Siberia have been doing is that if you eat it, you get a bit high, you get sick, but then your urine, your pee, is not going to make anyone sick. It's still potent, it's still psychoactive. So there's been a tradition of doing this, drinking the pee, and all that stuff. So they did this amazing project where they did this process, and then they created this wonderful gelatin-like sculptures. And they exhibit it in a gallery in this like a very pretty fridge. And yeah, and people can consume them. So I thought that was a very interesting project around, traditional indigenous practices, but also embodiment and what is happening in the body and how many things are involved there. And also the trust to the artist, right? Like, I'm trusting you, I'm gonna eat your pee, right? Yeah, so I thought that was an incredibly interesting project, and I would definitely follow up with them. We've already been in touch. And then, yeah, there's a lot of project in terms of aesthetics also around mycelium, which I think is very, very interesting. And it's gonna, yeah, that's gonna develop really nicely. The only thing is that, unfortunately, it's not only feminists and anarchists and vegans and all that stuff who are telling these stories, So for instance, this thing that you have slime molds, and maybe you've seen these pictures when you have a Petri dish and there is a slime mold, and then you have an oat flake, and the slime mold is growing to the oat flake. So that's been very popular, and it's a kind of model organism. So people are doing it now also, like, to teach and to show people. But this has been also used for, as a problem-solving thing, but also around effectiveness. So it also not have great uses, right? So they were trying to monitor and predict how people from Mexico are gonna immigrate to US using this model, or people from cryptocurrencies are talking about Bitcoins as working as a mycelium, So I think we are in a contested space of telling stories, right? And that's where I think activists, artists, and scholars need to start talking these through fungi as well, these stories to somehow compete or show the ideological backgrounds behind these bigger stories, which are now, circulating in the wider culture. Yeah, thank you, Rachel, for that question.
And thank you. And can I ask that everybody thanks Lenka again in virtual mode, I'm afraid, although we are here at International House, which is exciting. And we haven't been for such a long time. Also, and thank you so much for that. And it's really, really rich area. And I think we picked out just how unbelievably rich and how many different ways this project can develop and how much different sorts of visual material this might actually incorporate. And thank you so much, Lenka, for setting us off to an exciting day. We're going to actually go and do a bit of foraging this afternoon, which is also very exciting, and I'm quite looking forward to it. But thank you, everybody, for joining and for making this such a nice time, and from so many different parts of the world and the country. So thank you for this. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Thank you.